Grab your Indiana Jones fedora, dust off your Greek New Testament. We're going to embark on a whirlwind tour through the life and thoughts of N.T. Wright. This British theologian has been shaking up New Testament studies faster than you can say what St. Paul really said. So brew yourself a proper cup of English tea, put on some Bach, that's Wright's favorite composer, and we're going to get into the world of the new perspective of Paul and beyond. Born on December 1st, 1948 in Morpeth, Northumberland, Nicholas Thomas Wright, or Tom as his friends call him, he was destined for theological greatness, or at least a life of making other theologians scratch their heads in bewilderment. Little did anyone know that young Tom would grow up to be a theological Indiana Jones, exploring the dusty tomes of history to uncover the true meaning of the New Testament. So Wright's early years are pretty posh by theological standards. He was a chorister at Setberg School and went on to study classics and theology at Exeter College, Oxford. It was sort of like he was in theological finishing school, learning all the proper ways to pronounce Greek and Hebrew while sipping tea with his pinky out. But here's where things get interesting. Unlike many theologians who stay firmly planted in the ivory tower, Wright decided, I want to get my hands dirty in parish ministry. And in 1975, he's ordained as a priest in the Church of England. So picture it, it's a young, Oxford-educated scholar, armed with all the latest historical critical methods, suddenly face-to-face with real people, asking real questions about faith. And Wright didn't just settle for being a parish priest. No, that would have been far too simple for our intrepid theological explorer. He decides to juggle parish ministry on one hand with academic pursuits in the other. Because apparently, I guess sleeping is overrated when you're on a mission to revolutionize New Testament studies. So in 1978, he became a fellow and chaplain at Downing College, Cambridge. It was like he was sort of living a double life, mild-mannered parish priest by day, theological superhero by night, at least during office hours. And this dual role would shape Wright's entire career and his writing. It gave him a unique perspective that combined, yes, rigorous scholarship on one hand, but also practical pastoral concerns. And Wright's academic career, it took off faster than you can say eschatological restoration of Israel. He taught New Testament studies at various colleges in Oxford and Cambridge, and eventually became the dean of Lichfield Cathedral in 1994. It was like he was collecting academic positions in the same way that some people collect stamps. In the 1970s and 80s, a new movement in Pauline scholarship was brewing, and Wright was right in the thick of it. The new perspectives on Paul wasn't just a new interpretation, it was a complete paradigm shift in how scholars understood Paul and his theology. It was like someone had taken the traditional Protestant understanding of Paul, put it in a blender and hit puree. Central idea, Paul's concept of justification wasn't primarily about how individuals get saved, sorry Martin Luther, but about how Jews and Gentiles are united in one covenant family. It was like Paul was saying, you think you know Paul, but try thinking again. And key ideas from Wright's take on the new perspective, first is covenant and justification. Wright argued that for Paul, justification was primarily about God's covenant faithfulness and the inclusion of Gentiles into the covenant family. It's like he's saying justification isn't just God's cosmic get-out-of-hell-free card. It's about God keeping his promises and creating a new, united human family. The second piece was works of the law. When Paul talks about works of the law, he's not referring to good works in general, but to specific Jewish boundary markers, like circumcision and dietary laws. It's like Wright is saying, Paul wasn't against trying to be a good person. He was against using cultural practices as membership badges for God's people. 3, the righteousness of God. For Wright, this phrase doesn't primarily refer to a status God gives to believers, but to God's own covenant faithfulness. It's like he's saying God's righteousness, isn't something he hands out like party favors, it's just who he is and it's what he does. 4, future justification. Now here, Wright controversially argues for a future aspect of justification based on the whole life lived. It's like he's saying, your final approval isn't just based on your initial faith, but on how your faith works itself out in your life. And this idea has made some Reformed theologians clutch their pearls so hard you could hear them crack. And the impact of Wright's work on the new perspective was seismic. It was like he had just dropped a theological mic and then moonwalked off the stage. Traditional Protestant scholars were shook. Some Catholic scholars were intrigued, and a whole new generation of students suddenly had a new theological hero, but also a lot more reading to do. Next up is the quest for the historical Jesus, Wright's theological treasure hunt. So not content with revolutionizing Pauline studies, Wright decides to take on the thorny issue of the historical Jesus. Because apparently redefining how we understand Paul wasn't enough of a challenge for him. It's sort of like he looked at the most contentious areas of New Testament studies and thought, hold my tea, I'm going in. Mammoth series, Christian Origins and the Question of God, particularly in the volume Jesus and the Victory of God, what Wright does is he lays out his vision of who Jesus was and what he was about. And so if you're brave enough to dive in, here are some of the key ideas you're going to encounter. First is Jesus' prophet of the kingdom. Wright argues that Jesus saw himself primarily as a prophet announcing and inaugurating God's kingdom. It's sort of like Wright is saying Jesus wasn't just a nice moral teacher or simply a wonder worker. He was announcing a cosmic regime change. The second piece was eschatology reimagined. For Wright, Jesus wasn't predicting the end of the space-time universe, but the end of the present age and the restoration of Israel. It's like he's saying when Jesus talks about the kingdom coming, he's not thinking about floating on clouds. He was thinking about a revolutionary change in how God relates to the world that he created. Third piece is the resurrection. Wright insists on the bodily resurrection of Jesus as a historical event with world-changing implications. It's like he's saying the resurrection is not a nice spiritual metaphor. It was God's way of launching the new creation right in the middle of the old one. The fourth piece was Jesus' divine identity. Wright argues that Jesus understood himself as embodying the return of Yahweh to Zion. It's like he's saying Jesus didn't go around saying, I'm God, in so many words, but he was doing and saying things that only made sense if he was acting in the person of Israel's God, meaning that's who he is. And Wright's work on Jesus, it's like the theological equivalent of an Indiana Jones movie. It's a wild ride through history. There are a lot of surprising twists and turns, and at the end, you feel like you've discovered something precious, even if you're not quite sure what to do with it. And then, not content with just shaking up the academic world, Wright decides to take his ideas to the masses. He does this in books like Simply Christian and Surprised by Hope, where he presents his scholarly insights in a more accessible form. It's sort of like he's saying, this stuff is too good to keep locked up in the ivory tower. We're going to take it to the streets. And so in Simply Christian, Wright presents a fresh articulation of the Christian faith for a modern audience. It's like he's saying Christianity, it's not just about going to heaven when you die. It's about bringing heaven to earth here and now. Key ideas from Simply Christian. First is the echoes of a voice. Wright identifies 4 common human longings for justice, spirituality, relationships, and beauty. That these are echoes of the divine. It's like he's saying these deep human desires, they're not random. They're clues to what the world is really about. The second thing you'll find is God's project. That Christianity is about God's project to rescue and renew the whole creation. It's sort of like Wright is saying God isn't in the business of abandoning his creation. He's actually in the business of fixing it. The third thing you're going to see is Jesus as the fulfillment. Wright presents Jesus as the fulfillment of Israel's story and the answer to human longings. It's like he's saying Jesus isn't just a good moral teacher, he is the climax of the whole human story. And then turning to Surprised by Hope, Wright is going to tackle head-on the Christian understanding of life after death and the meaning of salvation. So here are some of the key ideas from Surprised by Hope. First, resurrection, not just heaven. Wright emphasizes the biblical hope of bodily resurrection, not just a disembodied heavenly existence. It's like he's saying Christianity, it's not about escaping the physical world. It's about God renewing and redeeming this one. The second piece that you'll find is the myth of progress. Wright critiques both the myth of progress and the idea of the world getting worse and worse. And so it's sort of like he's telling us that history, it isn't a straight line, it's not up or down, it's more of a complex story that finds its meaning centered on God's actions. And then the third thing you're going to see is mission redefined. In light of the resurrection, Wright redefines Christian mission as partnering with God in the renewal of all things. That being a Christian isn't just about saving souls, it's about being part of God's project to heal the whole world. These books made Wright a household name if your household discusses theology over dinner. And it's like he managed to translate all these deep academic insights into something your average churchgoer could understand and get excited about. It's not bad for a guy who can read Greek and Hebrew. And then Wright in politics, when theology hits the real world. So Wright, as we've seen, he's not just an ivory tower theologian, but he's also not just a writer of popular books. He's not afraid to wade into political issues, bringing his theological insights to bear on contemporary problems. And so, sort of like he took his theology out for a spin in the real world, and it handled pretty well, even if it did ruffle a few feathers along the way. So in books like God in Public and various articles and interviews, Wright has addressed issues ranging from economic inequality to climate change to the role of the monarchy. It's like he's constantly asking, what does the kingdom of God have to say about this? And so some of Wright's political stances, as you can imagine, they have been a bit controversial. He's critiqued both American imperialism and British colonialism, challenging the assumption of modern capitalism, and has argued for a Christian basis for environmental care. It's like he can't help but kind of stir up theological trouble wherever he goes. Very Indiana Jones of him. And one of Wright's most controversial political moments, it came in 2019 when he signed a letter supporting a no-deal Brexit. It's like he decided that redefining justification and rethinking the historical Jesus, that's not controversial enough. I got to kind of get into British politics and really spice things up. And then we have the infamous Wright and Piper debate where the theological titans clash. Because no overview of N.T. Wright would be complete without mentioning his famous debate with John Piper over the doctrine of justification. I mean, this is the theological equivalent of Tyson and Evander Holyfield, with Piper in the Reform corner and Wright in, well, the right corner. And the debate centered on Wright's understanding of justification and how it relates to Paul's doctrine of salvation. And Piper represented a more traditional Reform view and argued that Wright's view, it undermined the doctrine of imputation and the idea of Christ's righteousness being credited to believers. And Wright, in response, argued that Piper and the Reformed tradition, more broadly, had misunderstood Paul by reading him through 16th century lenses, rather than understanding him in his first century Jewish context. And the debate, as you can imagine, it spawned books from both sides. Piper's The Future of Justification, I love this part, a response to N.T. Wright, and Wright's Justification, God's Plan, and Paul's Vision. Sort of like a theological rap battle, but with less Kendrick Lamar and Drake and more footnotes and Greek words. And the Wright-Piper debate, it highlighted some of the key tensions in contemporary Protestant theology. Sort of like Wright and Piper, honestly, were having two different conversations, one about first century Judaism and the other about 16th century Reformation concerns. And as you can imagine, both claiming to be faithful to the writings of the Apostle Paul. So what are some of Wright's theological greatest hits? So beyond his major works, Wright has written prolifically on a wide range of topics. So here are some of the other writings that are worth highlighting. First up, What St. Paul Really Said. Wright's accessible introduction to his take on Paul. This is sort of like Paul for Dummies, but it's written by one of the smartest Pauline scholars around. The next one is The Resurrection. of the Son of God. And this is a massive scholarly work defending the bodily resurrection of Jesus, sort of like Wright decided to build a theological fortress that no skeptic could penetrate. We have Paul and the faithfulness of God. This is kind of Wright's magnum opus on Paul, coming in at, a mere 1,700 pages. It's like he decided to write everything he knows about Paul, probably even things Paul didn't know about himself. Next up is the day the revolution began. This is Wright's take on the meaning of the cross, sort of like he's saying, you thought you understood what happened on Good Friday. But let's think again. Then we have the New Testament people of God. First volume in his Christian Origin series, setting out his method and background. It's sort of like the opening act of this great theological rock concert. It's going to set the stage for the main event. And if you're a pastor, I highly recommend it. While it's massive, reading through the Christian Origins, I know for me and my understanding of the New Testament has been incredibly beneficial. So what about his more quirky side? While we often think of Wright as this serious scholar, he has some quirky facts too. First, he is the multitasking master. Wright is known for his ability to work on multiple writing projects simultaneously. He's like the theological equivalent of a juggler, and he's keeping several scholarly balls in the air all at once. And then the early bird. Wright's famous for his early morning writing sessions. They often start at 6 a.m. Because the early bird catches the New Testament theological worm. And then the poet theologian. Wright, not to be outdone, has also published several books on poetry, because apparently sometimes you need meter and rhyme to fully express the mysteries of God, how Romans ate of him. And then the Beatles fan. Wright is a big fan of the Beatles and has been known to use their lyrics to illustrate theological points. It's like he thinks all you need is love might have some theological significance. And then the legacy. What is Wright's lasting impact? Wright's influence on contemporary New Testament studies and Christian theology, it's honestly hard to overstate. He is like the theological equivalent of, the Beatles. Even if you're not a fan, it's hard to deny the impact that he has had on New Testament scholarship, because his work has reshaped how many scholars and pastors, including myself, understand Paul, Jesus, and the New Testament as a whole. And his emphasis on the Jewish context of early Christianity, the importance of narrative and understanding biblical theology, and the also cosmic scope of salvation has influenced a whole generation of students and also scholars.